honor to be invited to talk about my book. I've done it before a few times. I wrote this book now about 4 years ago, and talking about it today required me to do something that a lot of authors don't like to do, and that's read their own book. You know, actors sometimes don't like to watch themselves doing a performance, and there's some problems, there's some penalties in trying to read your own book. I'll talk a little bit about that all the way toward the end. But anyway, I'm happy with what I wrote, and I need to talk a little bit about, pardon me for a while, about myself and why I write this book. I'm a third generation Czech. My grandparents came over before the turn of the century, that is from 1900 to 2000. And my parents spoke Czech. I did not. I was a cantankerous kid and refused to learn the language. I know the little words that you do to I know food. I know such things as bochkere, and I know a few things a lot of things about a boy like don't talk, get out of here, go home. Those are kinds of the phrases I know pretty well. But I never really recall, and by the way, my parents always said that I was Bohemian. They never said that I was Czech. They spoke Czech, but they never really recognized that they were, in fact, Czechs. By the way, I don't see my own screen out here. Oh, that's why, because I know what I did. I went to a black screen. It's my error, excuse me. And as a matter of fact, I don't really recall ever meeting any Slovaks in Chicago. Now, the statistics show that the Czechs outnumbered Slovaks about 4-1 in Chicago. Now, we were on the north side, and maybe most of the Slovaks were on the south side, but I really had never met any Slovaks, which now brings me to my wife, Ann. I went to Indiana University for graduate school, and I met Ann there. She had Anna Mozolák, graduated from Hunter High School in New York. She's a second generation Slovak. She spoke Slovak before she spoke English. Her parents came over, and I'll say more about this, of course. But we met in Indiana, and in the summer or late of the fall of 1960, got married in 1961. And she's really the reason that I wrote this book, because frankly, I was fascinated with her family. Perhaps I would have been fascinated with my family and their immigrant experience if I knew more about my grandparents, where they came, but I was able to learn something about Ann's family, and that really was, I thought it was outstanding. So the peasant, as you know, was my wife's Slovak, my Slovak wife's grandfather. Let me go through in sort of an order so you have some idea of what's going on in this book here. Sam Mozolák was born in Krajné, a Slovak village. And by the way, this is the village that we did visit in 1971. Ann and I met with her parents, who returned back to Krajné, and her brother. And we visited there. I also saw my distant relatives in Bohemia as well. But I did have an opportunity to go to Krajné, so I had some idea of what I was writing about. Well, in 1902, Samuel sailed to New York at age 20. In 1905, he met and married another Slovak immigrant in New York, which was a pattern, of course, in that time. They rarely married Anglos. They looked for other Slovaks, people with whom they could communicate. And so they got married in 1905. And in 1906, they had twins. Now, of course, their plan was like the plan of almost everybody who came from Slovakia: come to the United States, make money, go back to Slovakia, and live in style. And sometimes people did that a number of times on occasion. They birds of passage, and they went back and forth between the United States and Slovakia. And I'm sure you know about that story. But they had twins, Jan and Susanna. Well, they can't make any money in New York in living in the United States with twins. So what do? They took their twins back to Krajné. And that was in June 1906. And the plan was that they were going to stay there for a while and then go back to New York. And in fact, they did. 1907, they returned to work to New York. And then they stayed there for 8 more years. With their fortunes made, they returned to Krajné. And in June 28th, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. And as you know, that started World War I. Samuel was conscripted into the emperor's army. He died weeks before the war ended in 1918. So here's my, my father-in-law now, and my, I guess my aunt by marriage, there's something I think of an aunt-in-law, that's what she was, Susanna. They're living in Slovakia. They're American citizens. And they decided to come to the United States. So my wife's father, now John, not Jan, emigrated to the United States. So I thought this is a fascinating story. My wife's parents sounded like my grandparents. They spoke with an accent, and I knew that. I understand it very clearly. And I just thought it was fantastic that they should have made that trip. And I actually knew immigrants who made that journey across the United States. So I wanted to tell the story. The question, how to do it. My first thought was to write a historical novel. Now, I'm an academic. Academics publish. I've written a number of books, about a dozen books. But I found out pretty quickly that I was not cut out to write a historical novel. It just wasn't in me. I might as well, you ask me to write a symphony, and I probably do just about as well. So I hacked away at it for a while, and I realized that wasn't going to work. So I went to plan B. I decided to do historical narrative. Now, the plan in the on writing is to write what you know about. Well, I knew nothing about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I knew almost nothing about World War I. I'm a political scientist, but my kind of political science is statistical analysis, data gathering, political parties across the world, and the United States too. But I was not really prepared for writing historical narrative. But then, as I started thinking about it, the only way to make it work is to provide context. I got to relate it to the emperor. And if I were able to tell the story of how a Slovak immigrant were to have fled this empire, come to the United States, and then be called back in service of the emperor, well, that might work. So that was my plan of action. So I decided to write about the emperor and the peasant in alternate chapters. Now, this is not a new idea of mine. Any of you who have read Erik Larsson's book, the marvelous book, The Devil in the White City, know that's exactly the way he's done it. On the one hand, he talks about the development of the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and then also this serial killer. And they're in alternate chapters. And if you haven't read that and you're looking for a good read, I would certainly recommend it to you. So I decided to do it that way. I'm going to write it in alternate chapters. All right. First of all, I had to write a prologue, because as I started reading about this, I realized I knew nothing about the Habsburg Empire. As a matter of fact, it doesn't come up in conversation very frequently today, does it? Now, you don't talk about the Habsburg Empire very much. And yet, at one time, it was one of the major empires in the world. And it covered a good part of Europe. And so I had to explain what the Habsburg Empire was. And then, of course, in explaining what the Habsburg Empire was, I had to talk about the background of the Great War. So I concluded before I could even talk about the emperor and the peasant, I had to give this long prologue. But once that's over, then you got into a series of chapters. My odd-numbered chapters all have to do with the emperor. And I imagine if one says, I don't want to learn about Sam Mozolák, I just want to read about the emperors in the Habsburg Empire, you'd skip all the even number chapters and read only the odd number chapters. I suppose that's possible. And I think it would hang together pretty well. So I talked about the emperor in Vienna and what it was like to be an emperor and how he got to be an emperor, because he became emperor when he was only 18 years old. And he really became emperor because he replaced somebody who was a little touched in the head, and they couldn't wait to get rid of him. And as soon as Franz Josef turned 18, they said, okay, you're emperor now. And it was a peaceful transition. Then I had to talk about the emperor's subjects. And I use subjects because at that time, they really were subjects. We think now citizens. No, they weren't citizens at that time. They were subjects. The emperor treated them as his little people. And surprisingly, they loved him. They loved the emperor. What they didn't like was the nobles above them, but they always thought that the emperor would take their interests in heart. And thinking about Queen Elizabeth now, and the reverence that a lot of people in Britain show her, you get some idea of how the emperor can command this respect. And we'll see, and that's actually throughout the whole book. But in addition to that, in a chapter on imperial ignorance, I spend a good deal of time. I think this is one of the best chapters in my book, if you don't mind me saying that. Because for me, I learned a lot about the emperors, and they were not trained very well at all to be rulers of the countries. And as a matter of fact, I just think that ruling by birth is a lousy idea. So I spent some time talking about that. And all these emperors thought that they were ruling by grace of God. They were divine. They could do no wrong. God would work through them. So when they were also the imperial warlords, the armies were their personal thing. They were in fact imperial armies. They weren't armies of the government. They were imperial armies of the emperors. And they saw themselves as deciders. They had the sole power of deciding whether to go to war. And in fact, all three of them exercised that power. Then I have a chapter on imperial armies. What was it like to be in service to the king? What did they carry on the field when they went out? And in the case of the Habsburg Empire, it was a terrible problem because they had 11 different languages. And basically, in the Austrian side, they were ruled by Germans. On the Hungarian side, they were ruled by Magyars. And these people who often didn't speak the German or Magyar were expected to follow orders. I spent some time talking about that, and then also coming to imperial irrelevance. Once the war started, the emperors had no role to play. To the extent that they tried to play a role, and that was the Tsar, Nicholas, it was a disaster and was quickly booted out of it. And then I go to have a final chapter of imperial losses. It turns out that all the empires lost. All the empires that went into the war against the Allied forces all disintegrated after the war. So I spent talking about that. All right. Now going over to the Slovak side. Of course, I have a chapter on the peasant in Krajné and what it's like to be a peasant. Spend some time about the kind of land they have, what their workload was, how they dealt with their Magyar overlords, how the peasants were dreamt about going to the United States or fleeing. Sometimes it wasn't to the United States, it was just simply going over to Austria, frankly, leaving Hungary and going to Austria. And then so the peasants in passage, which we already talked about, those people who did make the trip and how they actually traveled on the steamships. And of course, when it came to the army, peasants were recruited to fight for the emperor, and how how they managed to do that. Once again, how they managed to do that when they were faced with officers whose language they didn't understand. And in Peasants in Peril, this is when they were actually subjected to the rigors of the war. And of course, the peasants in war, how they actually fought. And that at that point, throughout this, of course, I'm talking about Samuel's part in this, or who I call, by the way, Samko, just so that it was kind of distinctive in the text. That was a diminutive that apparently some people used at that time for him. And then how he was wounded and how he eventually died in Italy, the Piave River, just weeks before the war ended. And then the final chapter was on peasant gains. What did the peasants actually gain from this war? Thousands, millions died, but I argue they actually gained something. Certainly the Slovaks did. They were under the yoke of Hungary and the Magyars for centuries, and they actually did at least get to Czechoslovakia, and then ultimately, of course, that worked out to their own country. And I have an epilogue on immigration and self-determination. And this takes sort of a broad look at the patterns of immigration in the United States and whether or not it was of value to the United States. And I conclude that, in fact, it really was. And there's a lot of problems with the issue, with self-determination, certainly as Woodrow Wilson conceived of it. And nevertheless, I think it's probably a worthwhile goal to proceed. So that's the outline of the book. I've taken perhaps a little bit too long to tell you that, but for those of you who have not read it, and I assume most of you have not and probably will not, at least you get some idea of what it's about. Now, the problem of connecting with readers. As I indicated, I've written books before, but not this kind of book. I mean, they're not for the general public. For students and for other colleagues and faculty, academia, it's a very different thing. So I tried to connect with the reader, and I tried to use operettas to draw upon operettas. And operettas at that time were very, very popular. And in the United States, many people formed their judgments or their ideas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire from the operettas, most of which were set in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So if you think about these plumes on the soldiers' hats and the balls and the nobility and the emperors, yeah, that was all in the operettas. There's also operas that I referred to. Der Rosenkavalier was a very popular opera, and really in the book it was regarded by some people as being philosophically important. And of course, Silent Night, 2012, this is an opera that was performed by the Minnesota Opera, and it got a Pulitzer Prize. And I must say, as a proud parent, that our daughter plays viola in the Minnesota Opera. And Ann and I were there on that night. We saw Silent Night. And it is a story about the armistice that both sides observed on Christmas Eve, the end of the fighting for a while. And finally, I refer to a TV series, The Fall of Eagles. Now, if you have not seen this, and I think probably most of your libraries will have it as a DVD, I would strongly urge you to check out, it's a TV series, but it's on one DVD, as I recall, The Fall of Eagles. Brilliantly discusses the interrelationships of the emperors at that time, and it is an outstanding historical study and very entertaining. Now, in my text, I try to rely pretty heavily on novels talking about things that I didn't know about at that time. As I said about the operettas, this is the way I use one of the operettas, and this is from my text. Just as tailored tuxedos adorned Fred Astaire, and of course, people in this audience will know who Fred Astaire is. In many audiences, they might not. But anyway, the resplendent uniforms were characteristic about that time. And it was the golden age of opera. And so the Franz Lehr's opera involved counts, barons, dukes, and supplements in a fictional Grand Duchy of Pontevedra. But it was a setting that was very typical of the actual settings that you might find in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I also try to use films, refer to films. Now, the 1916 film, to my great surprise, one of my colleagues, former colleagues in Budapest, told me about this. There was a 1916 film about the magnates in Hungary, and he told me about this. And there's another Hungarian silent film. And of course, Battleship Potemkin, many of you know. And All Quiet on the Western Front was really about World War I. And Duck Soup was really about kind of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, if you will. So those are period films that all of these I refer to in the book in one way or another. And there are modern films. Many of you may not realize that the African Queen was set in that time period. And when Humphrey Bogart was trying to sink a German ship in a lake in Africa, that was a German ship that was there to try to take over some property in World War I. And of course, Farewell to Arms and so on, Lawrence of Arabia, and going down all the way to the bottom to the Grand Budapest Hotel, a relatively recent film, and Stefan Zweig's work, who I cite in the book, was cited as a contributor to the Grand Budapest Hotel. So as I said, I tried to write the text in a way that would tie into some things that people could connect with in their own life. And then, of course, the novels. Here's a whole list of novels that I think were just outstanding, and I quote from a number of them in the book. Good Soldier Shake is, of course, a standard, and I do quote from that. I would suggest, if you're looking for something particular, the novels by Joseph Roth are just superb too. The collected stories in the Radetzky March is wonderful. And Timrava, That Alluring Land, I think is excellent. And you'll see that I have an excerpt from hers. This is from one of my chapters. I tried to figure out how could I present the call-up, these Slovak youths in the field who may not have even known that there was an assassination, that the Grand Duke was killed. Although they probably knew that, but they may not have known, certainly didn't know what the implication was for them. Suddenly they were called to serve. And how was that done? Well, Timrava gives a little story. Just after midnight, the town drummer began to beat out his summons. Cough began to roar like a lion. Proclaimed that a telegram from the imperial authorities announced that we have declared war. Therefore, you've got to go and show up tomorrow morning and go off to battle. Well, I've got a number of examples in there. For example, the decision, should we not go to the United States? And I think it's in Timrava's book, they talk about a meeting at one of the local taverns. And the drunker they get, the more attractive the idea of going off to the United States becomes. And some people actually did it. When confronted with the task of trying to provide a timeline for all this, I thought it was important for readers to know what was going on at the diplomatic circles at that level, but I really didn't know how to present it myself. So I hit upon the idea of using clips from the New York Times. And this series of clips is just a progression. I've actually myself, when I started reading the New York Times online through Northwestern University, I was able to to go through and do a search. I got fascinated by this. I really got caught into it in this time. And I'll try to give you an illustration. This is from one page in the book. Okay, the king and queen of Serbia, and that's the way they spelled Serbia at that time with the V. This is from 1903, if you see down there at the bottom, in June 12th. This is long before the war set up, but it set up the events for the war. And I have in yellow there that because of this, an independent Serbia became a political threat. And that particular assassination, when in fact a friend of Serbia's, of Austria-Hungary was assassinated, that sort of set up the motion for the assassination of the Archduke. I also spent some time talking in the book about immigration in the United States, and I found this to be a fascinating topic. When I started looking at the census figures, I found out before 1910 and 1920, they did not indicate ethnicity for immigrants. You were to come from, and I can see this in my grandparents' immigration. They came from Austria. And in fact, they were from the Austrian side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because they came from Bohemia, but they were not mentioned as Bohemians, so they were certainly not mentioned as Czechs. They came from Austria. But then in 1910, the Slovaks actually pressured the president to start putting in mother tongue as a test of ethnicity. And so in 1910, they started using mother tongue, but they did it badly. And so here's an actual page from the census from 1920 and 1910. And I've got it marked here. Take a look at this. In 1910, there were 281,000 Slovaks in the United States. 10 years later, there were 619,000 Slovaks. Woo! How'd you get 400,000 more Slovaks in the United States? Now, admittedly, there were more Russians that came in, but hey, Russia was having a revolution, you know, and these are basically Jews who fled from that. There was an increase in Poles too, but take a look at Czechs, a little increase of Czech, but not for Slovak. What was going on? Well, it turns out that in 1910, and I discussed this at some length in the book, the census takers weren't trained in the differences between Slovaks and Slovenes and Czechs and Ruthians and so on. And so they just simply said Slavish or something like that. They just didn't classify them right, or may have classified them as Czechs and they went as Slovak. Look down here, Slavic not specified, 34,000 in 1910, 3,000 in 1920. So he's doing something different. But it turns out that, to my great surprise, there were more Slovaks than Czech. Now, also to my great surprise, remember what I said. In Chicago, I hadn't met any Slovaks. Actually, the first Slovak I ever met, I married. So when I met Ann, that's the first genuine 100% Slovak I ever met. I said, I got to take advantage of this opportunity. So I did. But Slovaks just weren't very prominent in many cities. They were in Pennsylvania. In fact, they accounted for fully 1/2 of all the the Slovaks in the United States were in the state of Pennsylvania. And I talk a little bit about this. But then to my great surprise, I find out that later on, turns out that there are more people nowadays who recognize Slovak ancestry than Czech ancestry. And that was something that I hadn't expected to find. I also have a number of pictures in there to indicate the war and the progress of the war. And one nice thing about doing a book about an early time period is that anything published before 1923 is in the public domain. So that I did not need to get permission to use any of these. And these came from newspapers. The newspapers at that time did a fabulous job of putting out maps like this. This is from the newspaper. I can't remember where it was, probably the New York Times, but maybe not. And then I copied it, and then I put it into a computer, and I did some things like the Armistice Line. And this is Piave River, where Samko died. So he died just off the Adriatic Sea in Italy, far, far from his home. Having written this book some years ago, I had the task of finding a publisher. Now, as I said, I've written a number of books, but in my case, it was no problem because publishers were coming up to me often to work on academic books, so that wasn't a problem. But I found it very hard to find a publisher for this kind of historical narrative. And for a while, I thought I had it done with the Central European Press, University Press. And they had indicated that they were going to publish it, but they had a final meeting with the editorial board. And to my great surprise, after they had it for more than a year, they said, no, they weren't going to publish it. And they didn't give me a reason. I suspect, but I have no reason for thinking that, is that my treatment of the Magyars and Hungarians was not overly kind in the book. But I don't know whether that's true. But anyway, the day that I learned that they weren't going to publish it, I got a note from another publisher, Macfarlane. Now, Macfarlane is a press that puts out a couple of hundred titles every year, but it is not what I would call a standard university press or a standard press. They cut back on certain things, but there were some positive parts about working with Macfarlane. First of all, they used my cover design. Now, I have to tell you that authors love to design covers, and publishers almost always throw them in the trash as soon as they get them. But I like my cover design, and they like my cover design. So the book is what you see, that's essentially my design. They also did quick work, did very little copy editing, and authors like that. They like it when there's not very much copy editing on their work. And they were very demanding on photo quality. They sent back some things that they said, it's not good enough to publish. So I had to do a little bit, but I didn't mind checking on that. But there were some negatives. First of all, I got back from them what we call PDF files, completely done, already set with pagination. The message to an author is you can't change any of this, because you change it, you change the pagination, you change everything else, big costly, we won't do it. I didn't even bother. First of all, they changed Franz Josef to Franz Josef. I did an internet search, and I think this is probably just some person who was doing, there's a bee in the bonnet of the person who was doing this, who felt that it should be, I should change both parts. But it turns out that in internet, it's usually Franz Josef. There are far more references to Franz Josef than to Franz Josef, but that's what it is. But my biggest complaint, and this is what I said when you go back and reread a book, you say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that that happened, was that they eliminated the drop capitals. And you might say, what are drop capitals? Well, let me give you the text. First of all, the book that they got, my manuscript they got was probably longer than what they expected. And so they put it in a bigger format than is usual. If you note, my book is not 6x9, it's a bigger format than that. And that's because they use less pages and fewer pages. And also the type is small, really too small for people of our age. And when I quote something and they indent it into smaller type, it's really tiny, so it's really hard. But when I read a book, I like to have headings. I like to have the chapters subdivided so that as I'm reading part, I can pause because I come to an end of one part and I can go on to another part. And I prepared for that in my book, and they wiped it all out. This is what the chapter should look like. And it should use what's called drop caps. And that gives a space between sections. So for example, I'm just finished talking about the three emperors. And my last one is Britain's Edward VII. And then I wanted to go to another section, but it just runs together. You can't see it. And so it makes my book hard to read. So going back through it, I says, oh my gosh, every page is full of text. It's all gray. It really does not lend itself to reading. It's not reading friendly, if you will. So I was unhappy with that. Okay, how was it received? Unfortunately, there were no reviews in major US journals. McFarland said they were going to send them out. Maybe it did. Sometimes it's pretty arbitrary. I know sometimes things are not reviewed. But I got 3 long reviews in Russian journals, and very positive ones, I must say, because I have some, thanks to my wife's Russian background, I have some nice Russian connections. And I got 3 4-star reviews in Amazon. One had this little, I liked the title, but this person didn't think the title was very helpful. And oh well, you know, as long as she liked the book, that's good. One customer did buy 80% of the copies. That's me, you know. And but still, I like talking about the book. And thank you very much for another opportunity to do so. And I will go back to the start and leave it there. Brian, it's all yours. Or whoever's going to handle the questions now. I'm all done. I think I hope we're still around.
Brian, we can't hear you. I think you're saying something.
Brian, you're muted.
Apologies for that.
Okay.
So I was going to say that Helen has the first question. So go ahead, Helen.
Oh, okay. I was lucky enough to get a copy of Kenneth's book, and I've gotten through a fair chunk of it. One thing that you talked about in one of the earlier chapters was how out of touch the 3 rulers, or the 4 rulers that you talked about, how out of touch they were, how their court ritual was something from almost later medieval times.
Yeah.
And they acted as if it were, in certain ways, they acted as if it still were back in the day. On the other hand, the capital cities had telephones, they had telegraph, they had all kinds of technology, even subways, which I was kind of surprised about, railroads, etc. Was there, how did they square this? The rest of their empires were pretty light on the use of technology. Maybe the trains were the most widespread, the railroads. Was it an active choice on the part of, let's just say, Franz Josef, that it was an active choice to not use technology, not have it be put to use in the rest of the empire, just in the capital? Or was the use of technology of the day in the capital almost kind of accidental and despite Franz Josef?
Well, Helen, that's really an interesting question. And I'll tell you what, I'm reminded of an event which you probably will remember, of George Herbert Walker Bush. One time he left the White House and he went to a supermarket, and he went through the supermarket and found that they were scanning things. And he says, "Isn't that marvelous? What won't they think of next to actually scan prices?" And everybody else, hey, that's what's been going on for a long time. He was in a bubble. He lived in the White House. He didn't have to go out. He didn't have to go out there. And I think that's true for Franz Josef. He was in one of his palaces, and that was certainly true of the Tsar. He went in the palace. Maybe a little bit less true, certainly less true of the Kaiser, because he considered himself really pretty worldly. But the other part of it is that wasn't their responsibility to serve the people. You know, it requires some kind of a belief that it's your task to try to improve the lot of your people. And very often they didn't see it. Their task was to preserve their empire, to keep them in place, but not necessarily to make life better for their citizens. And now the generals, entirely different matter. Oh, the generals knew exactly, and I have a long section in there later on, you'll find out how they worked with stopwatches to see how many troops could go on and off a train at a certain period of time, and where the track should go, and why you should have two tracks going in two directions, so you didn't have to, so trains could pass each other. Well, that was a very different thing. So in war, yeah, in terms of handling the economy, not necessarily. So as a matter of fact, it turns out that there was an exhibition in Paris, and the nations, usually, certainly Hungary, just sent over their ancient costumes, and that not anything that they were really working on. Now, Hungary had a lot of bright people. That's where Nobel Prizes come from. So, but so I think that's it. First of all, the emperors lived in a bubble, and second of all, I don't think that they were really public goods oriented. I hope that suffices. That's my thinking. Anyway.
Thank you.
Okay, Ken. We actually, someone wants to give some more background on the census counting. So if Susan, if you will unmute yourself.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. I don't have your book yet, but I will certainly get it because some of my research is in this area. And I found it interesting when you were raising the question about the number of Slovaks in Chicago. And I think part of it is, as you pointed out, that there's periods of time when the census was inaccurate. But one of the things too is that the question of identity was a very fluid question for a period of time because of the political structures of the imperial area. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I did when I was a grad student at Syracuse, and I needed to take American history, which I was not interested in. And so I did a study of Slovak immigrants in Binghamton, New York.
Oh yeah, right, major.
And did the census reports there. And it was fascinating to find the number of Slovak immigrants that were there because of the shoe factory there. And Baťa was over in Europe. And so they went to Binghamton, which was a center of shoe production. And the interesting thing is too, the number of Slovak men who lived in boarding houses came single, and then at some point planned to return. And some returned with families and some didn't. So by the way, that book you mentioned, Bell's book on Out of the Furnace is also a great book.
Yeah, that's another one. You're right.
Yeah.
Right. That really tells how hard it was to work there, and the dangers of working there. And it's really interesting. I reflect on this here in Minnesota. Most of the people are Czechs in this area, and the Czechs are regarded as being an urban people, but in the United States, they went to the farmlands. Mm-hmm. The Slovaks, who were the rural people, went to the manufacturing. And the only reason I think that they did that is because they get more money. They really wanted to make the money, as much money as fast as they can, so they go back. So they did not plan to start a family. They did not plan to put down roots. They did not plan to plant, frankly, as the Czechs did. They came and decided to stay. And of course, there was some difference in the motivation, particularly for the Czechs early. It was a political motivation to come. They were fleeing in 1848. And the Slovaks really came here for the money, and that was the difference. But you're quite right. And the Out of the Furnace is a great book. I commend it too.
Yep. And there is another great study about Slovak immigrant women. At Benedictine, I also teach courses on immigration. And so I make sure, because Benedictine University was founded for Czech and Slovak immigrants up until the 1920s. Our student newspaper was in Czech as well as in English. And so I make my students research the archives and get all that information and see the immigrant history of Benedictine. But immigration history and the experiences of Czechs and Slovaks and different immigrant groups, and the assumption that some of them, immediately assimilated, when that is simply not the case. And there were so many cultural and religious associations that preserved identity.
Yeah, right.
All right. Thank you, Susan, for sharing that. We have another question from the chat. The question is, did you find yourself doing any genealogical research on the peasant? If so, what resources did you use?
Okay, I neglected to mention, maybe I mentioned it, but did not give him his due. My brother-in-law, John Moslak Jr., which is the way he always referred to himself, graduated. He was 11 years older than Anne, and they went into the military, had a nice career in the military, and he spoke Slovak, and he went back a number of times after the 1971 trip that we went there. And he's the one who did all the genealogical research. And I have a rollout map about 10 feet long from him. It goes all the way back into the 1600s that he's done. And he went back and he went to the churches, and he did some Latin with the book and some German and everything. He did an enormous amount of work. So everything in there that has it from a genealogical standpoint is really taken from my brother-in-law, John, who died, unfortunately, 2 years ago at 90, age 90 in New Jersey. But Johnny is the one who really did all that work for me. For a few things, I used ancestry.com. So I was able to get, for example, to my great surprise, a copy of my Susan Mozolak's passport application. And I got it from ancestry.com. And that's where I learned when she applied and when she left. I didn't know that on a return back. It turns out that apparently their mother kept their New York birth certificate when they went to Slovakia. So she could have just shown that birth certificate to come back to the United States. And she came back first. But maybe she wanted to preserve that for her brother. I don't know exactly, because he came back later, but she did apply for passport. She had applied at a time when I don't think she needed to apply for passport, because there were periods that you didn't need to. And as long as she could demonstrate that she was an American citizen, I don't think she would have needed to have a passport to come in. But those are a few things that I got from that. I got some, when one of Anne's uncles was naturalized, I got that from ancestry.com. Some things like that were not, that my brother-in-law Johnny didn't do, but otherwise, he really did all the genealogical work, not me.
Okay. All right, let me check the chat here, see if we have another question. The next question up will be Helen. Helen, go ahead.
I wanted to ask Kenneth, what happened to the family after Samko was killed in the war? What became of the next generations? How did they manage to come to the U.S.?
Okay, well, that, you know, that is in the later book, but what happened after he was killed, of course, his son Jan and his daughter, they were twins, Susanna, were at that point not yet of age. They were born in 1906, and so they would have been about 11, 12 years old. They were not yet of age. So there was no opportunity for them to come to the United States at that point. But my father-in-law, John Mozolák, got married in Slovakia, and he and his pregnant wife came to the United States. And of course, he came in as an American citizen with his Slovak wife. So that was no problem. And she was pregnant with John Moslak Jr. at that time on her ship. They seem to want to be pregnant on the ships going back one way or the other, it turns out. And the other one, his sister, Susanna, was they're twins, but they were so different. They were not just different in sex, they were so different in personality. She was, to put it mildly, when she came to the United States, a flapper. She dumped the name Susanna and she became Susie. And that was her name from that on. And she spoke better English, and she did all sorts of modern things and so on, and gave my wife perfume and things like that when she was a little girl, the kind of things that probably would not, her mother would not have done. So they both came to the United States. And so everybody came to the United States. Samko's wife died in Slovakia, but the rest of the family oh, that's right. They had one other son who was not a citizen, but he eventually came back to the United States, and joined the military and got citizenship as well. So they're all here. So everybody's here in the United States. We do, by the way, we do have some distant relatives. And when we went back in we went back twice, in 71 and again in 83, and I guess it went again in 90. Turns out that one of my daughters, Katie, when he stood next to one of her distant uncles, like a grand uncle or something, my God, they looked so alike. They were so similar. Their faces were just really alike. And they both admitted that. Yeah, sometimes your daughter won't wonder, I don't know. Yeah, I look just like him, she said. So.
Okay, I'd like to ask the next question, Kenneth. So I haven't had the chance to read the book, but I guess I had a question in general about, I guess, the unit that Samuel served with. So were his officers, were they Hungarians or were they Austrians? Or was it, I'm not sure how the army was structured, whether if the troops recruited from Austrian territories were commanded by Austrian nobles or officers, and whether Hungary was the Hungarians who were.
Yeah, it's really very complicated, Brian. And there's in the short thing, first of all, let's talk about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austrian side was very different from the Hungarian side. Austrian side, German was the language. And most Austrians knew some German. So that even if you were an Italian living in Austria, chances are you knew some German, because there was a much more dominant language, the language of commerce and so on. You couldn't even live in a small village without probably needing to know some German. Okay, that's one thing. And of course, Czech was a major language too, but a lot of Czechs knew German as well. Hungary, entirely different. Magyars were very different from the Germans. They were very nationalistic. I have a lot in the book about them closing Slovak schools, just systematically closing schools schools over time. My father-in-law went to school for a while in a Magyar school, and he hated it, dropped out, and he may know a little bit of Magyar, but just didn't retain any of it. So generally speaking, the officers in the Hungarian side were Magyars, but they had some rules that they didn't always follow, that if most of the conscripts were of a different language, then they had to be ruled, the commander had to be fluent in that language. Rarely was that followed. So even though they may have had mostly, let's say, Slovenes in one of the units, nevertheless, they wouldn't necessarily be speaking, they'd still be speaking Magyar. There were, however, a couple of units that were almost entirely Slovak. And Samko's unit, I don't remember, but there were two units that were, oh yes, I do know. His was one of the entirely Slovak units. And so presumably in an entirely Slovak unit, they had a Slovak commander, but there are almost no Slovak officers in the Hungarian army, in the Hunvid, where he was serving. And there were different, the king had his own army, and then the Hungarians had their own army. So there are almost no Slovak officers. So although by rule, they should have had a Slovak officer, I'm not sure they did, but the unit itself was almost entirely Slovak. So maybe they forced the Magyar to learn a little Slovak. That's all I can think of at that point. But that's really, it was one of the great problems. As a matter of fact, one of the great problems with the Austro-Hungarian Empire is that the Austrian side, being basically German and Czech, could not communicate with the Hungarian side, being mostly Hungarian. But even within, they couldn't communicate. There were so many language differences. It was 11 languages in this, and it was such a god-awful effort to try to communicate in that place. And at one point, Germany had the opportunity to embrace Austria and bring it into the Confederation, and it rejected it. And it's in the book. It says, no, Austria cannot be part of the German Confederation. Why? Well, because we have to bring in all these people who speak Croatian, and people who speak Italian, and people who speak Czech, and everything. And heavens to Betsy, a lot of them are Catholic, and we're a Protestant nation. So they said, no, we'll just keep it the way we are. But that was a big problem.
Could you tell us what page that was on? Or
Pardon?
what chapter that was in? What chapter was that part in?
That must have been in had to do with either the imperial armies, probably the imperial armies, or it would have been the section of peasants in arms. One of the two. Had to do with the armies, though.
Well, which one was it with the peasant? The second
Either the imperial armies or the peasants in arms.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Or the peasants at war. I can't remember where that would be. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I was aware. I mean, I was aware of there was enormous, I guess, language communication difficulties between, within the empire, but didn't quite realize it was so concentrated that way on the Hungarian side.
Oh yeah, the Hungarians. Yeah. Yeah. Well, basically, Magyars were the very doministic, like Orban now in Hungary. He's an autocratic, and the Magyars were very autocratic at that time. And I remember what I said about the Central European University, not doing the book. I don't mince words in the book, and so the Magyars. And by the way, I don't say that people speak Hungarian. Hungarian really is not the language. It's like saying that you speak British. You speak English, but not British. So the language is Magyar. And but they really forced it down the throat of people, and it was very, very hard to get anywhere. Anyway, it was a great. I thoroughly enjoyed doing this work. It was probably the most satisfying, personally satisfying book that I ever did, because it celebrated, I think that's the word I want to use, my in-laws' life. I just think, we sometimes use the phrase for somebody who has gumption. We say they have get up and go. Well, they got up and went. Immigrants, that's what immigrants do. And that's what I have in the epilogue of this book. Immigrants come, they want to do things. Most of the people who are sedentary, they don't have a vision. They don't have they'll stay put. And thank goodness for my grandparents who came over, and for everybody I look at, for your grandparents, your parents who came here. Those are the ones who said, things could be better. If I do something that's hard now, if I put together and take the money and take a risk and go abroad into a land that I'm not prepared for, I can have a better life. And they did. They got up and went. And my hat's off. I'm not sure I could do that.
Yeah, that is pretty remarkable. What the things that the journeys that these folks made. That's a good point. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please please speak up.
Yeah, and by the way,
caught up in the chat here, so.
And one other thing, don't hesitate to send me a question via email. My email address is probably all over the internet, so you just shouldn't have any trouble. But anyway, it's k-janda@northwestern.edu. But it's,
I did share that in the chat. So it was in connection with if folks wanted to purchase a copy of your book, that's the place to contact you. I did hear recently about I believe this is the Czech and Slovak Art Society. They have a couple chapters, but the New York chapter, they're actually holding a reading of Schweik this end of this month. So I'm going to try and look for that link and post it into the chat so folks can access it too.
Oh, correctly, that reading is from like 11 in the morning to 11 at night or something like that.
Well, yeah, it's the entire is it the first volume or what, or is that the entire volume?
Is it in Czech or in English?
English. It's in English.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that'd be a hard slog for total Czech. So
yeah, is it the old Bruce Parrott translation?
I'm not sure. I don't think there was those details in there. So, but I'm gonna look for it really quickly. So, yeah.
When I read that one, I finally discovered the meaning of the Hungarian swear word my dad used to use that made my mother see purple. I now know what it means.
Can you share that word, or is that not polite?
This is a family show.
Okay. All right.
Fine. Well, you said, Brian, that you wanted to wrap up by 3:30 your time, and I think we're to do that. I'm happy to stay for anybody else, but
I have one question that you might be able to answer fairly quickly. Did corruption play any role in the Austro-Hungarian Empire? The obvious one that comes to me is, and maybe this wasn't the case, paying to keep yourself or your son out of military service?
I don't know. I don't recall running on that, but I think the general rule, corruption plays a role in every country. I don't think that, is anybody going to challenge me on that point?
Nope.
My guess is that it would have played a role there. But I do want to mention something else on that. There's a part in the book when I talk about how is it that these people who are really so badly treated by their country would fight for their country. Slovaks who were stepped on by the Magyars, the Czechs were stepped on by the Germans in Austria. How would it be that they would fight for their country? And there's a big chapter in there that, believe it or not, most of them, the people recruited, the people recruited from the working class fought for their emperor. They did it for the emperor. And it was almost I think virtually every historian that I read makes that point. Now, it's not a debatable point, that when you ask them, it was a nationalistic fervor that they did it for the emperor. And now, that's at the beginning of the war. Later it's something else. If people were getting killed, it's a different story. But why would they go willingly to war? It wasn't a problem to get them to go to war. And they were worried about this. How could, in Hungary, the ruling Magyar class said, how are we going to get the Slovaks to fight? Well, there was no problem. They just went. And the same thing in Austria. The Germans were saying, how are we going to get the Czechs to fight? Well, they just went. And they did it for the emperor. Now, I find that hard to believe nowadays. But you have to understand that one thing, that the emperor was looked at, he was a distant figure. And we looked upon as a leader of the country and one who was untouched. He was not directly affecting them. Who was affecting them? Those nobles, the local nobles who were taking their taxes, not the emperor. The local nobles who were impressing them to work, not the emperor. It's all these local nobles. And who was fighting the local nobles? The emperor. So now you get some idea of why in Russia, the peasants would mobilize and they put a letter to Dear Father Tsar, because they thought the Tsar was the head. He was not responsible for their misery. He would fix it. So there was this belief that the person at the top of the pyramid doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know how much suffering they're having. If he only knew, it wouldn't happen. And so with this reverence for the emperor, that motivated people to go and fight for the country. And of course, it is true that in virtually every country, once you start cheering, talking about foreign wars, you want to go and beat the invader. There's really a nice section toward the end that I get from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote a book on this. And he said something about, at one point, everybody thought that Tsar was an nincompoop. He has no authority, was a vacuous. But once we got into war with Germany, suddenly everybody wants to go and defend the emperor, this brilliant man. How could that be? He said. But anyway, it's a motivation that in many ways is frightening, to be very honest with you. But that's what seemed to be pervading the country at the time. And
can I jump in here for a moment?
Yeah.
Kenneth, I'd like to piggyback on this conversation in the last few minutes. I'm Richard in Columbus, Ohio. Throughout much of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, there are castles to this day. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not totally mistaken, my impression has been that yesterday is history for many people in Eastern and Central Europe. Things that happened in the 13th century are as if they were yesterday. Wow. Sense of history is extraordinary compared to what we think in terms here in the United States. I'm thinking of Trenton and places like that, that have these great castles that people see to this day that remind them of what was. I'm thinking also of the role of religion in the book that isn't treated very much. I would appreciate a future book to deal with how Lutheranism or Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, and or other smaller sects might have influenced the lives of people that you write about in your book.
Yeah, well, you're certainly right about the castles, and they're there. There's a wonderful book that on the Czech Republic called Flags and Stone Castles, something like, and Stone Saints, Flags and Stone Saints. And it talks about how the Germans and the Czechs were divided by the statues that were, and those are the stone saints. They were divided by the statues and divided by the flags, and how they fought over that. That the Czechs would try to tear down the German statues, and the Germans would try to tear down the Czech statues. There wasn't anything like that within Hungary, because the Magyars were so dominant. But you're right about the castles, and it's the role of the nobility. Maria Theresa was the one who outlawed serfdom, and initially, and she also provided for education. Her reason for doing that was to 8th grade or to primary school. I don't know if it was actually 8th grade. She felt that a state could not be strong unless the people were healthy. And so she didn't want to educate the citizenry to the point where they could actually learn something, but they could read instructions and they knew how to do things, and that to make the state strong. So there was some of that, but for the most part in Hungary, it was the nobles with their big castles. That's really what exemplified power at the time. And so people still respected that. With respect to the Lutheran and Catholic churches, I don't know very much about that. The only thing in my reading is, in most cases, it was the Lutheran people who tended to push more toward independence and to try to establish a Slovakia by itself than the Catholics. But that's a limited basis of reading, I said, so I'm not sure that's true.
Thank you.
And 2:30 my time, 3:30 your time. I understand that what happens is that they roll up the streets out there in the East Coast. Is that right at this time?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Well, I just want to let folks know that I have posted a link in the chat towards that Shvekathon that I mentioned. So yeah, of course, yes, it is quite long. It starts at 2 p.m. and goes to 11 p.m. So if you have the endurance to sit through that, that would be rather impressive. So, but I've shared that it's a free event. So, and it's it takes place during the time of Kenneth's book. So it's another sort of aspect of I guess.
Yeah, it's quite humorous, really humorous and also relevant.
Yeah, and that's sort of how how the Czechs deal with authority.
Yeah.
And it's really resonates to this day among them. He's a very well beloved figure, or a very popular figure in the Czech imagination. So I'll go around the room. If anyone else has a question, this is your time. Please speak up.
Ryan, this is Rich Palaschak. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you turn up your mic if you can?
okay?
All right, go ahead, Rich.
Not a question, but a comment. I'm a first generation American. My father actually fought in World War I in the Tyrol Mountains.
Ah,
And I found your book particularly informative because he kept insisting that his officers were German, and the people that I spoke to kept insisting that that couldn't be correct because he was a Slovak. And your book pointed out several things that I was unaware of. One was about the artillery units being predominantly commanded by German officers.
mhm.
And that was the unit that my father happened to be in. And it was a Slovak unit, which was also different than what I could find out through other sources. So your book was particularly informative to me, and it reinforced what my father had described when he was actually fighting in the Tyrols. So thank you for that.
Why, thank you for that observation. It's always glad to, that's much better than saying it wasn't like that at all. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I have a question for Richard Korn, if you don't mind. Can you,
Sure.
okay. My brother-in-law was named Korn, but he spelled it with the C. Is there evidence that was that people with KORN sometimes change it to CORN? Because I never suspected that he was Czech or Slovak or anything like that.
Well, it turns out that the name was originally Polish from the Polish corridor from Danzig, Korniszewski. That's my father's side of the family. When my father's youngest brother was born, my grandfather wanted to get a job for the city of Chicago, and the only way you could do that was to drop your Polish name. And so he dropped it to Korn, which was, of course, a very good German name.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm trying to take this opportunity to intervene and do that, but I was curious. Okay.
Okay, I'll go around the room for just one last question. This is your chance.
Let me just say that I'd like to thank Ken for writing such an interesting, engaging book. This is Sam Simmons. I'm a member of Minnesota Sokol along with Ken and Ann, and I really enjoyed it and appreciate Ken sending me a copy of the book some months ago while I was looking for some good things to do during the pandemic. But given the concept of this book, I was particularly impressed with the fact that looking at the audience of people who might be interested in this kind of a thing, a juxtaposition between the royalty or the emperors of nations and the peasants during the fighting of a great war. You're taking a risk in getting into this of coming across as being too stiff academic for what most people who would want to read such a thing would think. And also on the other hand, since you're writing on a respected and family member, you're maybe taking a risk of possibly going too far the other side and having it be a little schmaltzy. And I have to say that Ken walked the tight wire of those things just perfectly and made it very interesting, very informative, but also had that personal engagement in it. And I think that's what really added to my enjoyment and made the book such a success in my eyes. So thanks, Ken. And
Thank you, Sam.
Sure. And again, thanks for getting me a copy of the book out so quickly. Appreciate that.
Okay, any other questions or comments before we go here? Okay, well, looks like we've come to the end here. So So Kenneth, I would like to thank you for leading a very interesting discussion about your book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I just received it yesterday, so yeah, I'm really interested in this story, and yeah, I did. So in the chat, I did post a link that you can contact Kenneth in case if you do not have a copy, you can reach him through that. And so anyway, so folks, thanks for joining us today. And like I said, in the introduction, this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel in the near future. So, and I will send out a link to everyone who registered for this event. And you can share that with your friends, and you can tell everyone, can share, if you want to share the news about our organization, that'd be greatly appreciated. So thank you for joining us today, and everyone enjoy your Saturday afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Brian, for asking me.